which ancient culture was way more faked up than most people know. What I always thought horrific was the imperial Chinese practice of 9 degrees, as in 9 degrees of relation. Say that someone seriously offends the emperor. The emperor then orders that not just that person, but everyone related to that person within 9 degrees of relationship is to be executed. Grandparents, parents, siblings, spouse, children, cousins, more cousins, more cousin, concubines and their children, babies in the cradle, old people who are bedridden, all their household servants, probably their in-laws too. Later emperors were more humane and simply executed the main offender, then sentenced all those people to exile, a forced death march of thousands of miles where the few survivors had to eke out a living doing hard labor. Feudal China was super into burying people alive. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor responsible for the unification of China upon his death, had 70,000 concubines, servants and workers forcibly interred alongside him. The terracotta army was constructed only because murdering all the soldiers as well wasn't an option. They later renounced that practice under the Confucians. There is a Chinese idiom for the origin of evil, attributed to Mencius Confucius, that literally means, may the first person who made terracotta figurines bear no offspring. Mencius Confucius was denouncing the use of terracotta figurines, since it is a substitute for human sacrifices and underlies a desire for which. Edit. Mencius Confucius thought the mere desire for human sacrifices is evil, and even the compromise of using terracotta figures is unacceptable. So wait, he was saying, no terracotta because we must sacrifice real humans, or no terracotta because really you want to be sacrificing real humans, and this simulacra hides at evil just under the surface. The second one. I'm listening to a History of China podcast. Chinese history is insane. So many murdered people, it would make the Romans blush. 3 kingdoms history be like 2 million people died in this minor border town skirmish. Meanwhile, medieval European history is like King John rode into town with 20 of his best knights and waged war against the town's baron and his 30 peasant fighters. The reality of a castle under siege, the movie version, is also fun. Movie. A city surrounded by siege engines, camps on all sides, 1,000s of men scaling the walls. Reality. 80 blokes are spread across 2-3 camps around the castle, whose walls are defended by 30 guys. After a year or so, the invaders might finally complete a single siege machine, but more likely the siege gear is limited to ladders and patience. Getting in and out under the cover of dark is fairly risk-free, so supplies keep coming. In some cases, the peasants aren't a participant and use the front gate as on any other day when their job brings them to the local lord's administrative center. This is funny in reverse. I'm so used to growing up with Chinese lit, where a small force is counted in the 10,000s, 1. And then when I read about the Crusades and 1,000 knights were considered an impressive army. That's when I went like, why, Honestly, one of my favorite never-saw-it-coming historical facts is that for all the brutality of the Ming dynasty, what ultimately brought them down was a preteen addicted to pornography. I feel most Chinese brutalities have something crazy behind it. For example, the Taiping Rebellion of 1850, which caused the deaths of 20-30 million people over 14 years, while some estimates go up to 100 million deaths. The Taiping Rebellion was launched by a guy called Hong Xiuquan, who was certain he was the brother of Jesus Christ. He gathered a large following and declared himself as the heavenly king of the heavenly kingdom of peace, and launched a rebellion against the Qing dynasty. You know what's even crazier about Hong Xiuquan is that the way he relays God's message is he pretends to have a seizure in front of everyone, and then suddenly gets possessed by God to give command to his men. His second-in-command soon figured out Hong's gimmicks, decided he also wanted to be a God's messenger, and faked a seizure in front of everyone too, and started to give God's orders. Hong was obviously pissed about it, but couldn't tell everyone without giving himself up. So both of them took turns getting possessed by God and relaying God's command to the men for a while. This would make a great Key and Peele skit low. Are you sure about that? I heard that the Ming Emperor was having an affair with the wife of one of his generals, and he deployed the general to the Great Wall of China at the frontier in an attempt to get rid of him. But to get revenge on the emperor, this general let the Manchurian army through one of the gates at the wall The Manchurians eventually overthrew the Ming dynasty and set up the Qing dynasty. Is this some tall tale of intrigue? I'm too lazy to look up and read all the history right now. What, please, I need this knowledge in its entirety. I need to preface this by stating you probably shouldn't put too much stock in this, as lying about the sexual practices of monarchs is incredibly common. But I believe it was Yingzong, and the story goes that the eunuchs basically distracted him with pictures of titties so they could rob the place. Blind and some of his military fuck-ups were responsible for laying the groundwork for a Qing takeover. There might be a grain of truth to it, as it wouldn't be the first case of a Chinese emperor having horrible consequences from being exposed to sex too early. Though in this case, the eunuchs were probably the bigger problem than the porn, as involving them in politics was considered one of the biggest mistakes of the Ming dynasty. It wouldn't be the first case of a Chinese emperor having horrible consequences from being exposed to sex too early. I know about Puyi, but which pre-Ming emperor was exposed to sex too early? This has piqued my curiosity. How does one force 70,000 people to be buried alive? You would think they would have considered revolting rather than just resigning themselves to their fates. Yes, I'm sure the soldiers would have threatened them, but you would think that such a large number of people could at least muster up a decent fight by keeping the army alive. Forget that. Imagine your population being so big and you caring so little that you can send 3 villages worth of people to die after the guy that ordered is dead cold and not think you know what. I might want those concubines, servants and workers around. Fuck that. If you go against the wishes of the previous emperor, the people might get the idea they can go against yours while you're still alive. Tradition is a hell of a drug when it comes to power structures. Here's what's really going to blow your mind. That's not even the largest amount ever interred. That honor goes to Exin, Yuan. I'd have to look up his name to get it exactly right, but he forcibly buried 200,000 enemy soldiers alive. Feudal China had that shit figured out. Edit, looked it up. I flipped his name backwards. It's Xiang Yu. The ancient Assyrians built a vast empire. The empire reached its height during the Neo-Assyrian era, from 911 BC to the fall of its largest city, Nineveh, in 612 BC. The Assyrian dominion, stretching from Egypt to modern-day Iraq, controlled richly diverse cultures. To quash any uprising in these conquered areas, Assyrian leaders utilized extreme violence. Their horrific campaigns were celebrated in stone reliefs, festooning the palace walls. They created tablets containing every single punishment the Assyrian army carried out. They cut off the limbs, gouged out the eyes, and then left those poor victims to roam around. Those poor people serve as a living reminder of the Assyrians' cruelty. The Assyrians were proud of the mass execution. The victim's skin was hung on the city wall. The brutality of the Assyrians was extreme, even for the ancient standards of cruelty. Assyrian relief, princess in garden reading poetry, musician playing harp nearby, fruit trees decorated with severed heads, strange fruit. This is actually the backstory of the story of Jonah. He was trying to run away because God told him to go preach and pastor to the Assyrians. He didn't want to because they were horrible, and God was like, when I say love everyone, I mean everyone. And then God makes him a little vine canopy to sit under, and when God sends a worm to kill it, Jonah throws a big fit. And God's like, come on, how made could you possibly be about a vine that just grew yesterday? And Jonah literally says that he's so angry he could die. Jonah's always the most extra. Jonah is definitely up there as one of the most relatable people in the art. Read this as original trilogy. The entire book of Nahum in the Bible, one of the shortest books of the Bible, consists of nothing but oracles of condemnations against Assyria and its capital, Nineveh, and prophecies about their doom resulting from God's judgment against them for their cruelty. Here's an example. 1 woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and plunder. No end to the prey. 2 the crack of the whip and rumble of the wheel, galloping horse and bounding chariot. 3 horsemen charging, flashing sword and glittering spear, hosts of slain, heaps of corpses, dead bodies without end. They stumble over the bodies, 4 and all for the countless whirrings of the prostitute, graceful and of deadly charms, who betrays nations with her whirrings and peoples with her charms. 5 Behold, I am against you, declares Jehovah of hosts, and will lift up your skirts over your face. And I will make nations look at your nakedness and kingdoms at your shame. 6 I will throw filth at you, and treat you with contempt, and make you a spectacle. 7 and all who look at you will shrink from you and say, wasted is Nineveh. Who will grieve for her? Where shall I seek comforters for you? Where shall I seek comforters for you? 18 Your shepherds are asleep, O king of Assyria. Your nobles slumber. Your people are scattered on the mountains, with none to gather them. 19 There is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous. All who hear the news about you clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not come your unceasing evil? In the period of the divided kingdom, where the Israelites are divided into a northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and a southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, the Assyrians invaded and conquered the kingdom of Israel, and exiled its people, resettling them in other territories in order to wipe out their identity. These are the lost tribes of Israel. Other vanquished peoples were also resettled in Israel. But in conquering Israel, Assyria was just as typically cruel as they were to the other peoples they conquered. They attempted to conquer Judah as well during the reign of Hezekiah, but they only lay waste to dozens of other cities. But they did not end up conquering Jerusalem. There is a relief of the Assyrian king Sennacherib's campaign in the British Museum made by the Assyrians, commemorating how they lay waste to the Judean town of Lachish and brutalized its inhabitants with vicious tortures, skinning them alive and pulling them apart, and other barbaric acts. One of my fave moments from Dan Carlin's renowned hardcore history podcast is when he reads the account of a scribe who visits Nineveh 100 to 200 years after the decline of the Assyrian. Although its former splendor is evident, the city has fallen into ruin, and the current residents, who live in shantytowns outside the city center, wonder at who it might have been that was able to build such a mighty city. Or what the city may have been called, all that blushed to be forgotten entirely only a few years later. I recall hearing the same story around Greece and Sparta, where a visitor asked the locals where the ruins of some former cities came from, and nobody knew. It's common. Also, how was discovered. An Italian was traveling in the area and the guides led them to a hill to camp out of the wind. The Italian man noticed mud brick walls using bitumen as mortar. He also found many inscribed tablets just lying on the sand. When asked, it turned out this was not news to the guide. To him, it was just an abandoned settlement like all the others in the area, unimportant. All the others? Asked the Italian. And the guy casually said that all hills along the river are ruins. Essentially how the wider world learned about the Sumerians' existence. Xenophon, the Greek general, saw the ruins as his army was escaping from Persia after being on the wrong side of a civil war. They had to trek across the entire empire through hostile territory to get home. It's the inspiration for the 70s movie The Warrior. Fun fact. In the TV show Archer, the character Pam has a stanza from Byron's poem, The Destruction of Sennacherib, tattooed across her back. It's about the slaughter of an Assyrian army, perhaps the most badass tattoo in fiction. Pam has a stanza from Byron's poem, The Destruction of Sennacherib, tattooed across her back, for the angel of death spread his wings on the blast, and breathed in the face of the foe as he passed, and the eyes of the sleepers waxed deadly and chill, and their hearts but once heaved and forever grew. Still. It also gives context to why Jonah was so reluctant to go to Nineveh. He hated them for what they had done, and is angry that God could be merciful even to them. Exactly what I was going to post. That's some fucking huge missing context. I believe the Achaemenids, Persians, overthrew them and decided that it's probably a better idea to make your subjects happy instead of afraid of you. Cyrus let Jews return to their homeland after centuries of exile. And that's why Persians, Assyrians, no wonder they called him Cyrus the Great. I really wonder if this is actually true. It sounds like a logistical nightmare, not even mentioning why his successor would be fine with losing so much loyal manpower. I'm fascinated by them both, but Persians would have been more pleasant to live under for sure. It is a shame that Persians are often vilified. Even by modern standards, Persian Empire was very multicultural and quite a pleasant empire to live in. If one traveled to ancient Rome, some 5,000 crucified rotting corpses would guide you the way. I'm really glad we invented signs. It is a shame that Persians are often vilified. Even by modern standards, Persian Empire was very multicultural and quite a pleasant empire to live in. Sparta. People in general remember them as just being these badass super soldiers, but don't know how Spartan society was built on draconic slavery and institutional pedophilia. Sparta has to have the best historical power of any peoples ever. A tyrannical slave state with a mediocre military record has gone down in popular memory as super soldiers that fight for freedom. It goes to show you how history changes over time. When we got to the German death camps in Wuyi, the US had the mindset to get the media there, have pictures taken, and film it as well. And they said that was for Paleo to see what was done here, and because in time, people would deny it ever happened. And they were right, even with the photos, video, and writings about it. It's very unfortunate. It reminds me of something I read on Stormfront many years ago. One of the guys there was appealing to the rest to drop the Holocaust denial, saying, "My grandfather liberated Dachau. He saw the pile of corpses with his own eyes. The Holocaust happened." One of the other people in the thread rebutted with, "Oh, really? Did he personally witness every one of them being led into the gas chambers and the switch being thrown? Sheesh, if that's your line of reasoning, you might as well deny that anything you haven't personally witnessed happened or even exists at all. Sheesh, if that's your line of reasoning, you might as well deny that anything you haven't personally witnessed happened or even exists at all. There are a disturbingly high number of people like that. Also the Spartiates, the soldiers in 300, had to murder one of their slaves to become adults. In the movie, this was portrayed as an epic fight against a wolf. 300 has done some heavy pour for Sparta, that's for sure. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt were 10 generations of absolutely fucked, bookended by 2 actually good leaders. Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Their family history would make for a fun, trashy soap opera, full of backstabbing, famicide, and a truly appalling amount of incest, as they spent 200 years running Egypt into the ground. Too bad it was all real. And yes, Cleopatra was one of history's few inbreeding success stories. She managed to get all the best traits of her insane family, and none of the bad ones. If you've got a little time, listening to Blue at Osp lose his mind, trying to describe the Ptolemaic kingdom is hilarious. The Ptolemaic gene pool made the Habsburgs look like the Pacific. The Ptolemaic dynasty had less genetic diversity than the average Crusader Kings player's dynasty. So much inbreeding Cleopatra got the pure-blooded trait. The family trees helps. Imgur, Comforty 6, Cake 6. So Cleopatra Selene, whose mother and father were siblings, had a daughter with brother X and a son with brother X. Those children married, but the girl still had a child with her uncle X. This child in turn married the child between brother X. This child in turn married the child between brother X and another sister. And 2 of their children produced the famous Cleopatra V. Did I get that right? Not necessarily ancient, but the Iroquois. They had many rituals of torture for prisoners of war, including ripping out fingernails, cutting off fingers, followed by forcing them to run the gauntlet, and then, if they survived, they would be scalped and burned alive. The real correct answer, though, is that every group of human beings was, by our current moral standards, absolutely brutal. Nothing the Iroquois did here was unique or particularly worse than many other groups. I just haven't seen anyone mention them in this thread yet, so I figured I would. I was recently stunned by the amount of atrocities the Japanese Empire has done. Mutilation of babies, forcing kids to rape their mothers, putting mothers into chambers with boiling grounds to test them if they would put their kids on the ground so that they don't get their feet scorched by stepping on their bodies, carrying baby corpses on bayonets. Not to mention carving a hole in the belly of pregnant women to rip fetuses cold-blooded and then murdering the fetus while the mother is screaming. There are literally no words in any dictionary to describe what they did. When people think about the atrocities of World War I, they usually think about Mengele and the horrific experiments the Nazis did. A lot of people don't know that the Japanese did a huge amount of equally horrific and evil human experiment. Unit 731, for those who want to really horrify themselves. I read about that. Absolutely horrid. Shows the depravity of human behavior at its worst. Maybe in the West, the rest of us in East and Southeast Asia remember what they did. Sorry, you're right. Mine is a Western perspective, and we were taught extensively about what Germany did, but I don't think I ever even heard about Nanking until college. And got away with it for the most part. America granted immunity to the leaders and doctors that performed these experiments, in exchange for the information they accumulated from the research. They used to take captured us Marines and cut off their Uzbek tattoos and force-feed the flesh to them. They would force-feed them oatmeal, jump on their stomachs until they puked it all up, and then start the process again. They would cut off their genitals and shove them down their throats. They would torture and mutilate them. They would use them for bayonet practice, but purposely avoided vital organs, so they would suffer multiple stabbings. List goes on and on. Their bodies were left out for their comrades to find later. Japan's horrific atrocities have forever affected their relationship with the rest of Asia. The horrors they committed through the 30s and 40s cannot be understated. My grandfather fought them in New Guinea and near disowned my dad when he came home in a Japanese car once. I was about to make a very similar comment. My grandfather fought in the Pacific Theater and wouldn't buy Japanese anything. We weren't allowed to watch anime in his house or play Nintendo. He bought a Subaru Outback because he thought it was an Australian car, and we let him think that till he died rather than tell him. He came around to buying German stuff in his later years, but he was adamant that Germany had paid for what they'd done and made their country safe for Jews and minorities, and Japan hadn't done the same. He was never racist, probably because he knew Japanese. And German Americans are often in the us because they were fleeing their country's conditions. This grandpap, my pap, was my mom's step. Dad, my dad's dad, was German and pap knew his story, so I'm sure that helped, but he strongly boycotted anything from any country he perceived as not atoning enough for their actions during war. My grandma was always a bit racist about the Japanese for what was done to her brother. He came home from a POW camp emaciated beyond recognition and traumatized so hard he was a very cruel man for the rest of his life. Was involved in some nasty British Empire conflicts in the late 40s and 50s. What we would today call black ops probably continued the cycle of cruelty of some of them. Dude, how do you bring up the atrocities of Japan without mentioning comfort women? The soldiers lined up to rape them repeatedly each day, performed hysterectomies on them with no anesthetic when they inevitably got pregnant, tattooed their bodies, brutalized them on their whim, killed them in horrific ways for so much as verbalizing a desire to leave, forced the others at gunpoint to watch these prolonged executions and consume the bodies, killed them in horrific ways anyways just for fun. And to this day the Japanese government insists these women, estimated between 50,000 to 200,000 abducted women and young teenage girls, were volunteers. Why such a huge range? Well, when people are murdered for funsies, forced to cannibalize the dead and prone to hurling themselves off cliffs, a ton of evidence is destroyed and it gets really hard to narrow it down. Watched a documentary on YouTube about a Korean comfort woman. She was 15 and told she was going to work in a factory, which is why her mother encouraged her to go. When the doctors at the facility found out her age, they discussed if she was too young for the work, but ultimately decided she was old enough to comfort the soldiers. She tried to kill herself by drinking an entire bottle of alcohol, but all it did was tear her stomach up. She was an adult by the time she finally got back to Korea. When she worked up the ability to tell her mother what happened, her mother had a heart attack. Like many comfort women, she doesn't want Japan's monetary compensation. She wants a sincere apology from the Japanese government acknowledging the harm they did to her and others, along with a statement admitting to falsely claiming they were all volunteers and or prostitutes. This was the comment that closed the tab for me. Fuck this shit. Japanese Empire were among the worst in history. But the Imperial Japan isn't really an ancient culture. Most ancient cultures were way more cruel than people know or imagine. Just capital punishment is a great example. It's not that you did something bad and we will kill you. Oh no. It's you did something wrong and we will torture you in unspeakable ways. Death is not the goal. Here it's just a byproduct. History is the worst. People died more easily. You had to make a statement to set an example. And boy, were they creative. Spartan society was fueled entirely by slavery. Massive slave population, actual citizen force, pretty small and useless at anything but soldiery, according to Aristotle. The Spartans knew full well the slaves could snap and revolt at any time, and they outnumbered the masters so hugely they could possibly win. So the Spartans had a policy of keeping their slaves constantly in fear. They even had a public holiday where they massacred slaves just to break their will. A lot of Pacific cultures practice cannibalism. Some still do in Papua New Guinea. But Maori here in New Zealand did in some tribes as well. So the worst insult you can use in the Maori language, pokokokua, means to boil your head, harking back to when people were boiled and eaten. Genghis Khan and the Mongolians of the steppe were absolutely ruthless and efficient. Entire unknown civilizations are reportedly wiped out by them with zero trace of their culture intact, just fields of bones saying something big was there. There was at least one incident of a drunken Mongolian post-raid demanding a group of runaways remain still while he stumbled off to find his sword and kill them. And they did out of fear for what would happen had they not. There was an instance of a relatively small recon element of Mongolians who were sent over some mountains in Irk, modern-day Russia, Ish region, just to see what over there, stumbled onto an entire joint nation army and mersed them all, conquering the whole damn place. The Khans were a hard people. Oddly enough, though, they were relatively progressive for their time. Once your people were conquered, they didn't really care what you did, spoke, believed, as long as you paid your tributes. They even protected from outside raiders. It's just, the whole getting massacred and conquered part to deal with source. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast Wrath of the Khans. And memory, there was one instance of a unique brutalism that came back to mind. So, being the progressive conquerors they were, they pretty regularly honored the beliefs and gods of their enemies. In one such instance, they'd sacked and captured a host of nobles who believed it was unholy to spill high blood. In response, the Mongolians decided to honor their traditions, and rather than cut them to pieces, they laid the nobles flat, built a dance floor on top of them, and partied like hell while the nobles were crushed underneath. No blood was spilled. Once your people were conquered, they didn't really care what you did, spoke, believed, as long as you paid your tributes. I've heard it speculated that this is why they were able to grow to be the world's largest empire. It's thought that people were less likely to stage a revolt since they could keep speaking their language, practice their religion, have their own government, and stuff like that. Where other empires largely sought to assimilate people to their ways, the Mongolians didn't care as long as you paid up. Or else, the Mongols were less of an empire who conquered and ruled, and more of a horde that turned up, slaughtered half your folk, and then left you to your own devices unless you stopped paying tributes. Then they would come back and kill the other half. I know people wouldn't be surprised by hearing about the Aztecs due to the human sacrifice from war prisoners. But oh boy, it was way worse. If I recall correctly, there was a moment of betrayal that happened from, and I'm doing this from memory, they decided to break peace by killing a princess-like figure by removing her beating heart, and when inviting her father to an ominous meeting showing a boy wearing her skin and clothes. Eat it. For those in the comments trying to say this is a distorted view of Mesoamerican painted by the empires that crushed them, why can't you just accept that, yes, their genocide is horrific, but they weren't angels either? It is not hard to see both things as horrible and disgusting. This very thread is proof humans everywhere can be horrible. That just makes them human. The Romans are looked up to this day for their achievements, and you still have Crassus making their soldiers collectively stab their own as punishment for losing to the slaves they would later crucify and torture. You have Japanese monks have a heartbreaking last stand with guns against their most famous conqueror, and you can still read sources about how they had a whole romance with preteen monks and prostitutes, which was seen as perfectly normal at the time. History is full of incredible people and incredibly horrible people. It gets so much worse. The Spanish were able to recruit the help of many other people groups when overthrowing the Aztecs because they were so hated by the people they subjugated. They often used these subjugated people groups practically as livestock, collecting large numbers of them to be ritually sacrificed to their gods in incredibly barbaric ways, ripping out their beating hearts while they were alive, skinning them, and other such acts. Other sacrifices, such as for the dedication of temples, involved extremely high volumes of sacrifices and appear to have been done by beheading the victims. The dedication of the Pyramid Temple at Tenochtitlan in 1486 involved the sacrifice of 80,400 prisoners over the course of 4 days. At that pace, 15 victims would have to be killed per minute. Lower estimates place the number of sacrificed victims at 10,000. 4 altars were set up at the top of the pyramid to carry out multiple simultaneous sacrifices facing each of the sides of the pyramid, with the victims' bodies being tossed down the sides of the pyramid as human blood ran down its steps. They sacrificed children to their rain god every year to ensure that they would keep getting rain. The tears of the children were thought to bring the rain, so they would torture the children ahead of sacrificing them to their rain god, Taluk, to make them shed as many tears as possible. Wikipedia's entry on Aztec human sacrifice says, Tlaloc is the god of rain, water, and earthly fertility. 43. The Aztecs believed that if sacrifices were not supplied for Tlaloc, rain would not come, their crops would not flourish, and leprosy and rheumatism, diseases caused by Tlaloc, would infest. The village, 44 archaeologists, have found the remains of at least 42 children sacrificed to Tlaloc at the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan. Many of the children suffered from serious injuries before their death. They would have to have been in significant pain, as Tlaloc required the tears of the young as part of the sacrifice. The priests made the children cry during their way to immolation, a good omen that Tlaloc would wet the earth in the raining season. 45. Wikipedia's entry on Tlaloc, in the section on child sacrifice rituals, says the Atlacomulco festivals was celebrated from 12 February until 3 March. Dedicated to the Tlaloque, this Ventina involved the sacrifice of children on sacred mountaintops, like Mount Tlaloc. This form of human sacrifice was not only specific but necessary in the eyes of the Aztec. The children were beautifully adorned, dressed in the style of Tlaloc and the Tlaloc. The children were chosen by the community, and although this selection came with honor, being selected came with great responsibility. Furthermore, these children were not usually of high social class. The festival of Tzotztontli, 24 March, 12 April, similarly involved child sacrifice. During this festival, the children were sacrificed in caves. The flayed skins of sacrificial victims that had been worn by priests for the last 20 days were taken off and placed in these dark, magical caverns. The irony is that the main allies of the Spanish, the Tlaxcala, weren't much better. A lot of groups in Mesoamerica liked their child sacrifice. The Inca would send them up the mountains to freeze to death. The Inca weren't Mesoamericans, though. Anyway, a lot of South Americans, not only the rulers of Inca Empire, were big on human sacrifice. Chimu, Moche, Nazca, basically, whichever civilization was dominant in any given period of time, they all killed people for their gods, often including children. The last case when a child was sacrificed due to native religion was in freaking 1960, after a massive earthquake. An Aztec holiday ritual involves some of the most fucked up practices I've heard of. What's worse with that story of the princess is they thought they were honoring the princess by skinning her. It wasn't meant to be malicious. In 1323, they asked the new ruler of Culhuacan, Aquicometl, for his daughter, in order to make her the goddess Yaochihuatl. Unknown to the king, the Mexica actually planned to sacrifice her. The Mexica believed that by doing this, the princess would join the gods as a deity. As the story goes, during a festival dinner, a priest came out wearing her flayed skin as part of the ritual. Upon seeing this, the king and the people of Culhuacan were horrified and expelled the Mexica. We'll never know if it's a true story or not, but the Aztec did do some fucked up stuff. But seeing as our sources are the Aztec themselves, hard to distinguish fact from legend, and the conquistadors who know. It's not particularly ancient, and the actions aren't as fucked up as many of what is listed here, but I find absolutely insane that East India Company, a private company, ended up accidentally colonizing India. The idea that a company that exported tea would end up with a standing army is some real sigh if dystopian shit. An Aztec holiday ritual involves some of the most fucked up practices I've heard of. What's worse with that story of the princess is they thought they were honoring the princess by skinning her. It wasn't meant to be malicious. In 1323, they asked the new ruler of Culhuacan, Aquicometl, for his daughter, in order to make her the goddess Yaochihuatl. Unknown to the king, the Mexica actually planned to sacrifice her. The Mexica believed that by doing this, the princess would join the gods as a deity. As the story goes, during a festival dinner, a priest came out wearing her flayed skin as part of the ritual. Upon seeing this, the king and the people of Culhuacan were horrified and expelled the Mexica. We'll never know if it's a true story or not, but the Aztec did do some fucked up stuff. But seeing as our sources are the Aztec themselves, hard to distinguish fact from legend, and the conquistadors, who knows? What's always cooked my noodle is imagining all of the horrible, awful, no good stuff that went down before recorded history. The most ancient civilization we have information on a fake is the Sumerians. Also, supposedly, the Egyptians are dated as far back as well, 4000 BCC, so 6,000 years ago. That's all we've got of recorded human history. 6,000 years. Humans have been around for way longer than 6,000 years. The first modern humans, or Homo sapiens, date back 200,000 years. That's 3 as long as recorded human civilization. Imagine the type of shit that went down. It wasn't just a bunch of random monkey-looking people hanging out by themselves. They absolutely got banded up into tribes, and you know they went to war with each other. They could have built entire civilizations and burnt them down repeatedly. 200,000 years is a lot of years to get up to shenanigans. Yeah, no. And it's completely lost to time. Just poof, gone, as if it never happened. Which is honestly what will happen to all human endeavor. On the timescale of the universe, we're all just a fart in the wind. No one will remember squat about this period of human history 200,000 years from now. And what they do remember will be completely distorted from the truth. Samurai and feudal Japan. People like to imagine the samurai as some kind of noble order built around the belief that honor and service were to be held above all. Samurai didn't give half a sideways fuck about the common peasant. They were a blue-blood aristocracy that used their power and training to perpetuate a totalitarian regime that would make the House of Windsor blush. Some examples of the dupliciousness that people like to gloss over showing disrespect to a samurai was cause for instant death, and disrespect could be something as simple as not bowing low and long enough. Oh, Mr. Old Rice Farm, does your back hurt from slaving in the field for your feudal lord? Well, tough shit, I don't care how loud your spine cracks when you touch your head to the ground for me. If you twitch, that a beheading, the code of battlefield honor, only really counted when the losing side put off just the right amount of fight. Not enough to be a problem, but you still had to do some pointless dying to keep from all being killed anyway. Example: Oda Nobunaga committed a genocide against the Ikki monks because they had the audacity to not insta-cave when he showed up. After several long sieges, he burned the hilltop fortress of Ishiyama Hongan. Oda set fire to the mountain and blocked any escape, burning alive 20,000 men, women and children. The idea that samurai hated firearms because they saw them as dishonorable or unsporting is bullshit. They hated them because they evened the playing field. Any peasant with a arquebus could kill any samurai before he even got his sword out, and that was not okay. They couldn't have their absolute martial superiority questioned, and especially by a weapon that didn't require years of special training, and more importantly, the free time to do that training, something your average rice-farming peasant certainly didn't have. Ronin were not noble samurai seeking truth through walking the land or whatever the fuck people believe now. They were dispossessed lords who were now turning to banditry against any peasant who dared to not support them with free food and logic. They were the equivalent of a former SEAL team, 6-member walking the road with his weapon, who will kill you if you don't buy his lunch, let him sleep in your bed, fuck your wife, and then bid him adieu with a smile and call of thank you for your service. So yeah, samurai were aristocratic mass-murdering assholes. Edit. Just to make it a bit more clear, the Boshin War, which was waged at the start of Meiji Imperial Restoration, that pitted the samurai class against the new imperial court and standing army, was fought 100% on the samurai side to keep their protected class. The imperial court even tried to compromise and offer them high-ranking government positions, but it wasn't enough. They still wanted to keep their places in Japanese society, and one of the stated rights they didn't want to lose was the right to carry swords in public for the purpose of protecting honor, i.e. killing a commoner on the spot if they perceived any disrespect. Also, the samurai forces suddenly didn't have an issue with guns once they started losing to ranks of peasants armed with them. Suddenly, the shogun forces were all about that firearm life. Edit. Lol. Apparently the 12th century isn't ancient enough for some clowns. The ancient Phoenician Carthaginians had a child-killing cult. They thought that their gods needed children to be appeased. Other Canaanite-Semitic peoples dropped this practice, depicted in the Tanakh, Bible's Old Testament, through the story of God sending a goat when Abraham was about to sacrifice his son. Although ancient Jews' annual ritualistic slaughter of thousands of animals is nothing to scoff at, murdering kids is obviously far worse. Even the Phoenicians' peers, contemporary cultural civilizations of the period, thought it to be a barbarous practice. Here's Plato on the subject. With us, for instance, human sacrifice is not legal, but unholy, whereas the Carthaginians perform it as a thing they account holy and legal, and that too, when some of them sacrifice even their own sons to Cronus, as I dare say you yourself have heard. In one notable case, during the late Sicilian Wars, Carthage itself was almost besieged and defeated. It got so bad Carthaginian civilians had to be pressed into the army instead of relying on their mercenary army. Carthage scraped by a victory at the Battle of White Tunis, but since it was so terrible, they thought the gods were punishing them. So in the aftermath of the battle, Carthaginian tried to appease the gods through, you guessed it, human sacrifice. 300 adults and 200 children were ritualistically murdered. Here is Diodorus Siculus describing the event. They also alleged that Kronos had turned against them, inasmuch as in former times they had been accustomed to sacrifice to this god, the noblest of their sons, but more recently, secretly buying and nurturing children, they had sent these to their sacrifice. And when an investigation was made, some of those who had been sacrificed were discovered to have been substituted by stealth. In their zeal to make amends for the omission, they selected 200 of the noblest children and sacrificed them publicly, and others who were under suspicion sacrificed themselves voluntarily, in number not less than 300. There was in the city a bronze image of Kronos, extending its hands, palms up and sloping towards the ground, so that each of the children, when placed thereon, rolled down and fell into a sort of gaping pit filled with fire. 10 million Africans died under the reign of King Leopold II of Belgium. Absolute horrific brutality. He belongs in the same category as Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot. Sorry, not very ancient, but his name doesn't come up in these discussions enough. Wasn't King Leopold also a sadistic pedophile? Many horror stories from his era. Ancient Greece. A lot of people imagine clean villas, people with white togas talking about arts and philosophy all day. The truth is that most people were dirt poor. Being born disabled or being born a girl could be a death sentence, and pedophilia was rampant among the rich. Also, a lot of their economy was based on slavery. Pedophilia being rampant among the rich powerful is a frighteningly common thing throughout history. Funnily enough, the Persian Empire was actually way better than it was portrayed. It was extremely open to different religions and were very advanced in civil liberty. When you really look at it, the Greeks were kinda the baddies in the wars between these empires. Even Alexander basically said that after conquering Persia. But because we get a lot of our information about the classic period by Greek and Roman writers, Persia was seen as a barbaric, tyrannical state. One time I visited Canada in 2004, and they poured maple syrup on pineapple pizza. Lo what? I'm a Canadian citizen and have never seen someone put maple syrup on any kinds of pizza.
We did it!
Jake, I've never actually seen this. When I was watching Castlevania, I did some research where the Dracula myth comes from and stumbled upon Vlad Tepes' Dracula, or by his nickname called Vlad the Impaler. They are not sure about the numbers, but you have to impale a lot of people to get that nickname. Carthaginians were apparently quite fond of burning their toddlers for shits and giggles. Okay, religious reasons. Kinda counterproductive, ain't it? Though it might be all Roman propaganda for all we know. All of them. We're genuinely a fucked up species. Aztecs were pretty messed up, but Babylonia. They left behind whole walls of sculpture depicting how many hundreds of thousands they killed for sport. I'm pretty sure it was worse when Neanderthals walked amongst us, but no written record. Finally, the good answer. The worst atrocities are the ones we don't know about because winners write history. There is a quote if you read through history. The good guys always win. What are the odds? We like to think before the slave trade as parts of Africa were all peaceful and great, but really they were already enslaving each other, and many larger kingdoms like the Zulu and Dahomey were oppressing the smaller one. What Spain did about 500 years ago with the Inquisition, it's nuts.